Chapter 23. Miss Rion's Story. 2 weeks later, when they rang the bells to alert us that we had arrived at Fallin, I flew out of my hammock. I'd been salivating over the chance to step on dry land for the first time since Pattaya Island, but as I climbed the steps to the quarterdeck, I saw that it wasn't going to happen. Instead of happy sailors lined up at the rowboats, our crew was grim and quiet. Payun stood at the rail, concern woven into his brows. "What is it, sir?" I asked, taking the scope that he held out to me. "I'm afraid we won't be going ashore after all," he said. "It isn't safe for us. Take a look." I surveyed the bay where we had dropped anchor. Fallin had surrendered to Mankan early on in the longest war without putting up a fight, and it was our flags that flew above the town on the shore, but beneath them flew another banner, yellow with a black spot. I gasped. "Fever flags?" Payun nodded. "Lustrous fever, if I had to guess. The captain won't let anyone go ashore. They'll have to row barrels of fresh water out to us." Looking through the scope, I didn't know whether to be disappointed or relieved that we wouldn't be stopping here. I had expected Fallin to be a green, vibrant place like Pattaya Island, but it couldn't have been more different. From what I could see, Fallin was made of mud. The streets near the harbor were slick and greasy, and the water was stained brown. The people I could see on the docks moved slowly, as if their feet were clogged in sticky muck. In the distance, the hills that rose above the town looked scraped bare. "I wish you could have seen the trees of Fallin," said Payun sadly. "When I was here last, they were as tall as towers, their crowns peeking up above the mist in the mornings." He gestured to the sails above us. "It was their height that doomed them, the perfect height for a warship's mast." My eyes tracked up the mainmast, and I tried to imagine a forest of trees that tall standing guard on the shore of this desolate harbor. "Fallin is one of the places you discovered, isn't it, sir?" Payun's face was a stone. "I was on one of the first Mankan ships to arrive here, but people have lived here for thousands of years. I made a map of it, that's all." "Oh, of course. Sorry, sir." He sighed heavily and drummed his fingers on the railing. "I know that's how everyone talks, Sai. I talked that way too once. Our queen is sending ships out in every direction to discover new places. I'll put money on it that every place our ships land was already discovered long ago, just not by us. That won't stop us from planting our flags there, of course. A growing kingdom needs lumber, materials, food. Why pay for it when you can claim it and call it your own?" He waved his hands at the dingy harbor. "Look at Fallin. They surrendered, and we still took everything they had, down to the stumps." He held still for a moment, then turned to me. "What do you think of all that, I looked behind me to see if anyone else was listening to us. "I see your point, sir, but I don't think you should say things like that to anyone else but me." He smiled and put his hand on my shoulder. "Don't worry, I won't. I trust you not to tell anyone my treasonous thoughts." I tried to smile back as I handed him the scope. "Since we aren't going ashore, I think I'll go lie down, sir. I haven't been sleeping very well." As I went to my room, I tried to brush off the guilty feeling that had risen when Payun said he trusted me. I told myself that even though I was making my chart behind his back, it was for a good reason, and I would be coming clean very soon. Bo and I had now gone through every single document in Payun's cabin. My fingernails were stained with ink, my neck had a cramp from bending over my paper, and my eyes felt sunken and dried out from keeping such late hours. For all that work, I still didn't feel quite sure that what I had was good enough. I hadn't told Miss Rion what Bo and I had been up to. I didn't want to raise her hopes for nothing. But the time had come to show her my map, whether I was ready or not. Now that Fallin was off limits, we would need to stop at the southern outpost of Avon's Island for more water and provisions before continuing on. From there, if we set out southeast as Payun had planned, there would be no changing course. If any of my work was going to be useful, we had to share it with Payun and the captain, soon. Late that night, Once I could be sure the crew's card game had ended, I knocked on Miss Rion's door. "Have you brought me a midnight snack?" she joked, opening the door and ushering me inside. She had washed off her eye makeup and wore a simple tunic instead of her usual formal jacket. It made her look much younger. "Do you have good news for me?" I handed her my chart, and her face instantly brightened. She took it to her desk to examine under the lamplight while I explained what I had been working on. I told her everything but left Beau out of it. I didn't think Rion would care about a stowaway, but something made me want to keep him a secret. "Sigh, my goodness, I had no idea you could do this." Rion's smile grew bigger with every word. "What a talent you have. Even I can see it, and I know nothing about map making. And these words, they look just like Payun wrote them himself. I couldn't tell the difference between the two if my life depended on it." "Oh, thank you, miss." I hadn't copied Payun's handwriting on purpose, but I had been writing in his script for so long that it had become a habit. I was glad to see Rion so happy with my work, but the map was still incomplete. Yes, it was drawn well, but it was missing the one thing we needed. She pointed down at the chart to the blank expanse where the Harbinger Sea was. "You have sketched in some lines here and rubbed them out again." "Yes, miss, that's the trouble." I sighed and slid my hand down my face. "I've gone through every single document that Master Payun brought with him and read everything twice over, but I can't find any good evidence, anything credible, that shows where land might exist in the Harbinger Sea. There have been faraway glimpses, but those could just be mirages, tricks the light plays on sailors' eyes when they've been too long on a voyage. I know Master Payun, and I know he won't accept such slim evidence as a reason to go looking for the Sunderlands. He'll need something really solid to convince him, and we're running out of time to find that." "I see. And Payun still thinks we should strike to the southeast from Avon's Island?" "To map the sea ice," I said miserably. Rion let out a sarcastic laugh. "Well, that would be quite a discovery worth exactly 0 leks and no lineals." I pressed the pads of my palms into my eye sockets. I felt like I could sleep for days. What we need is an account of someone who saw land up close. We need numbers, measurements, a drawing, something more than just a story. Preferably without any mention of snakes or dragons, I added mentally. "Without that, we'll be going back to Mencon with empty pockets," Rion said. "Well, not all of us," I grumbled. Rion looked up and tilted one perfectly trimmed eyebrow at me. "I'm sorry, miss," I added quickly. "I didn't mean that. I'm very tired and Rion smiled and slid my chart across the desk. "It's all right. You didn't offend me." She walked around behind her desk chair where her jacket hung. Her lineal brooch gleamed softly in the lamplight. "I know what you must see when you look at me. You think this expedition is just a fun excursion for me, don't you?" I pressed my lips together and looked at the floor. Rion rested her arms on the back of the chair and leaned forward. "Sai, what I'm about to tell you is a secret that very few people know," she said quietly. "I'm telling you because I trust you, and because I want you to understand me." I nodded, waiting for her to go on. "I know everyone on board is wondering how I got a place on this expedition." "You and the captain are old friends. You saved her life." True, but that's not quite the whole of it." Rion took a deep breath. "Anjali Sangra is my sister." I blinked, unsure I had heard her right. She gave the statement a moment to linger in the air between us before continuing on. "To be more specific, she's my half-sister. We have the same father, but different mothers. My mother was a servant on the Sangra estate. Without being vulgar, I'll say that my birth was not exactly welcomed by anyone in the Sangra family." Her easy smile tightened, least of all by my own father. "After I was born, my mother and I were sent away." I was speechless. I never would have believed that Rion, who carried herself with enough class to be a princess, was the child of a servant. To be fair, Lord Sangra made sure our lives were not difficult, she went on. He even paid for me to go to school. But it was crystal clear from the beginning that he claimed no part of me and bore no love for me at all. She caught my shocked look. Don't feel sorry for me, Sai. I swore early on I'd never feel sorry for myself. After school, I found my own ways to get by. I've always been good at cards, she winked. I've always been good at cards. She winked. I earned enough at the card table to keep afloat, and then I joined the Navy. I worked my way up through the ranks, always with my eye on my sister. She'd never been told about me, though I knew everything about her. I wanted to be as close to her equal as possible when I revealed myself to her. You understand why? I nodded. You didn't want her to think you were asking her for favors. Exactly. Everything I've achieved, even this, I've earned on my own. Rion's fingers tapped the golden lineal on her jacket. But a few months ago, I finally did ask my sister for a favor. I begged Anjali to include me on this expedition. She leaned forward, and her eyes blazed in the lamplight. This is a chance to get something more important than money, more important than a whole string of gold lineals. A name. Discovering the Sunderlands will vault us straight to the top of Mencon society. We will be celebrated and sought after, and I'll finally prove that I'm deserving of my father's esteem. I watched her fingers curl around the lineal brooch. I do understand you, miss, I said softly, more than you know. Rion smiled at me gratefully. I want to show you something. I should have shared it with you weeks ago. She reached down into the front panel of her jacket and took out a small paper packet. She unfolded it and held up a white square of fabric. I bought this in the harbor market before we departed, she said. Do you know what it is? My words were barely a whisper once I got them out. I know exactly what it is. It was a fisherman's map, just like the ones Payun had shown me from the trunk in his cabin. The woman who sold it to me told me its story, continued Rion. 100 years ago, a Pramong ship was found adrift on the edge of the Harbinger Sea. The ship's masts had snapped off, and the hull was taking on water badly. All the crew were gone, except for one man. Rion's words tumbled out excitedly. The remaining sailor was near death. He didn't explain why their ship was so far from home, only that they had been caught in a storm and pulled across the Harbinger Sea. In his fevered state, he spoke of a lush continent whose rivers were lined with jade and whose forests were full of trees twice the height of our tallest masts. He said the seas all around were thick with whales and dragons with hides of shimmering gold. Rion caught my eye. I know how it sounds. I would feel skeptical if it were not for this. After the sailor died, they found this piece of silk in his jacket. This is a map he made of the Sunderlands. She handed the cloth to me. My quickened pulse made my fingers tremble. The map barely covered my palm. Faded lines snaked across the silk, forming the headlands and harbors of a continent that extended past the edges of the fabric. I've held this little map against every chart I could get my hands on back home, said Rion. I haven't been able to find any place in the world that matches. The silk had a ragged edge, as if the map had been torn or cut. It had no words on it at all, no longitude or latitude. Without those missing pieces of information, there was no way to know for sure where it was made. But the coast had been drawn with such detail. Even in its faded condition, I could see that whoever had drawn it had really seen this place, and close enough to make a good, solid map of it. Best of all, this was a Pramong chart. Payun respected them more than almost anyone else. This is exactly what I need to make our case to Master Payun, I said excitedly. Once he sees this and hears the story of where you got it, he'll be convinced. I'm sure of it. I'll leave out the part about the dragons, of course, I laughed. Rion stiffened and reached for the silk map. Talk to Payun about your own chart first and see what he thinks. If he responds well, you can bring him to my cabin and we'll show him my map together. I'll hold on to it until then." She folded the map back into its tight square. Her easy smile returned, and she tucked her hair behind her ears. "Now, we should both try to get some rest while we can. The crew tells me we're headed for rougher weather." "This is going to change everything, miss," I said, as she closed the door to her cabin behind me. I headed down to my room and climbed into my hammock. As I rocked side to side, I thought of what Rion had said about earning a name for ourselves, about being celebrated and sought after. I imagined a glittering room packed with important people. In my vision, they stood aside for me, bowed to me, smiled, and tried to catch my eye. This is going to change everything, I thought, as I drifted off to sleep. Everything.